Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I am Ann Albert, the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, as many of you already know. And as always, I'm really pleased to be here with you to introduce one of our Jewish Studies public lectures. I will be introducing and moderating this second talk in our series on Jewish messianism. Before we begin, as always, a little bit of thanks and a little bit of business. We are very grateful, as always, to the Klatt family that has funded my position and the Harry Stern Family Foundation, also to the Katz family and the rest of our board of advisors and friends of the Katz Center. There are just tons of people who have done a lot to support this work we do, bringing scholarship to wider audiences, and we very much appreciate it. I am also privileged and grateful to be part of a wonderful team here at the center, so I want to acknowledge my colleagues who make all of this possible. To those of you who are joining us maybe for the first time, so you know the program is being recorded, and along with our other public lectures, it will be posted in a few days to the Katz Center's YouTube channel. And I think you'll find shortly, if not already, a link to that in the chat. The recording from last Tuesday's program with Matthew Novenson is ready to be posted. It should be posted shortly if it hasn't already. So look for that very soon. It's a way that you can revisit. If you're taking notes, you can find the details you missed, and you can share the videos with friends. And you'll find there also like an increasingly large library of past talks. I will also say, because this program is being recorded, if you are a US voter and you are with us right now and you haven't voted yet, I think it would be great if you went and voted instead of watching this with us during this hour, and then you can catch up later. I really mean it. I know that might seem odd, and I don't speak for the Katz Center, but I think I would just really encourage you all to make sure that that's happening. If you have already voted, fantastic. And if you plan to afterwards, terrific. And also please help make sure that your friends and family are engaging in the vote today. Now, for those of you who didn't just jump up and leave and go off to vote, if you're still with us, I want to say that I'd be delighted to see your questions submitted using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can post them anytime during the whole hour. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I will ask a selection of them. And I do appreciate being able to see what everybody's asking about. So don't be shy, just drop your question right in there anytime. All right, now to the substance for today. Today's program is the second talk in a four-part series of talks devoted to Jewish messianism. We began last week with Matthew Novenson of the University of Edinburgh, who was talking about messiahs and messianism in the time of early Christianity. So he was juxtaposing Jesus with others who were called messiahs in the era, including Herod, Bar Kokhba, and Judah HaNasi. For today, we'll jump ahead many hundreds of years to encounter a different kind of figure, a different kind of messianic narrative that really responds to that distance and to that moment of being so removed from the biblical and the ancient context. So we have with us to do the talking, Professor Micha Perry. Micha teaches in the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa. He teaches there about medieval Jewish culture and focuses in a wide-ranging way on bilingualism, identity, and documentary culture. He's also taught in the past at UCLA and at Yale, and we had the really great pleasure of hosting him as a fellow at the Katz Center last year, probably the most prestigious thing on his resume for sure. So Micha is the author of a number of publications and has a number of research projects going, all of which are fascinating. But among them, for relevant to this talk, is a book that he published in Hebrew on knowledge transmission among European Jews in the Middle Ages. So if you're a Hebrew reader or speaker, check that out. And more recently, he published in English a book called Eldad's Travels, A Journey from the Lost Tribes to the Present. And that is highly readable and fascinating. And if you are here today, you'll probably just have your appetite whetted and you'll want to go and check out that book afterwards. All right, with that, Micha, I invite you to take it away and welcome.
Thank you very much. I am so pleased to be here after spending the spring semester at Penn. This is sort of coming back home. I had such a wonderful time. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I also want to thank Anne for inviting me and Deanna for facilitating all this, and Brian for his technical help and expertise. It's a pleasure being here. I have the fortune of dealing with medieval Jewish history, meaning I deal with the most fascinating stories there are in Jewish history, and the sources don't really need me to interpret them and to give you my opinion about them. Just reading them is fascinating enough, and I think this is mostly what we'll do today, and you'll see how this contributes to the understanding of messianism in the Jewish world. The veil is lifted upon our picture after the Arabs have conquered the Middle East and the southern basin of the Mediterranean. In the 7th century, the Muslims go out of Saudi Arabia and conquer basically most of the known world at the time. And for the first time, the Jewish people find itself, after a long while, under one culture, one language, one way of thinking. And the routes of communication are open between the East and the West. And sometime at the end of the 9th century, the Jews of Kairouan, in this city here, they were puzzled by something that they needed an authoritative figure to explain to them what's happening.
Seems as though Micha's connection is breaking down. There you go. Can you hear me? You're muted, Micha. We'll try again. Micha is coming to us from far away, so we're going to be a little bit patient with possibly chunky internet connection. Thanks, everyone.
I apologize. I went to vote. This is what happens. So the Jews of Kairouan in northern Africa send a letter to the leader of the Jewish world at the time, Tzemach Gaon, their spiritual leader, because they're puzzled by something. And this is how the letter starts. We wish to inform you, our master, that a man by the name of Eldad Ha-Dani, from the tribe of Dan, visited our community. This Eldad Ha-Dani does not understand so much as a single utterance in either the language of Cush or the language of Ishmael, meaning he doesn't speak any African language, nor Arabic, only the Holy Tongue. Moreover, the Holy Tongue that he speaks contains words that we never heard. So in order to understand their bafflement of this voyager who stepped on their door thread, we have to go almost more than 1,500 years back. In biblical times, the land of Israel had two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea. In Judea lived three of the tribes, Judea, Benjamin, and part of the Levites. And in the north lived 10 tribes, among them also the Levites. And somewhere around the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyrians, and all the 10 tribes were exiled somewhere beyond the river Tigris, somewhere beyond Nineveh. The biblical phrases talk about Hala, Habu, Hara, and the river Gozan. Nobody knows exactly where it is, but they disappear. Nobody heard of them for over a millennium. In between, from biblical times to Eldad's time, when he reappears in the 9th century, we encounter scattered stories about them. For example, here are some of the rabbinic opinions regarding the 10 lost tribes. This is from the Mishnah Sanhedrin. The 10 tribes are not destined to return, for it is said, and cast them off to another land, as is this day. This is from the Bible. Just as the day goes and does not return, so too they went and will not return. This is Rabbi Akiva's view. So if some of you out there in the audience don't believe that the 10 lost tribes exist, that they remain Jewish, that they live somewhere in a magical land, you're good to go. You have Rabbi Akiva to count on, maybe the most famed Tanaic figure in Jewish history. On the other hand, Rabbi Eliezer said, as this day, just as the day darkens and then becomes light again, so too the 10 tribes, even as it went dark for them, so too will it become light for them. Meaning, one day these tribes would return. And indeed, soon enough, these 10 lost tribes became part of a messianic view. They are destined to return at the end of times, at the apocalyptic time, after the parousia, the second coming of Christ, or maybe with the Jewish Messiah. The person who single-handedly brought back the 10 tribes into historical circulation was this guy, Eldad Ha-Dani. For 1,500 years, nobody heard about them. They were a myth, a story. And all of a sudden, Eldad comes, this strange voyager, and says, hey, here I am, from the tribe of Dan. So let's go back to this letter and see, how did he portray him? Who was this guy? Where did he come from? And where did he go? So the beginning of the letter again. We wish to know that a man by the name of Eldad, the Danite, from the tribe of Dan, visited our community. He told us that 4 tribes, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, are in one place, ancient Evilas, where the gold is. Evilah, Chavila, is a biblical place from Genesis. It's not a specific place we could pinpoint. Eldad continues, they have a judge by the name of Abadun, and they pass judgment on cases involving the 4 capital punishment. Residing in tents, they travel from place to place and set up camp. So these tribes are somewhere beyond our frontiers, but in a known place called Evilah, and they're nomads that travel from place to place. He continues on to tell about their culture. Although they possess the Hebrew Bible in its entirety, they read from neither the scroll of Esther's deeds, for they were not involved in that same miracle. If you remember, the story of Esther happens after the destruction of the first temple, meaning almost 150 years after the tribes were exiled. So they don't know, they weren't part of that story, so they're not engaged with it. Nor the scroll of lamentations, lest their heart be broken. They don't want to hear about the destruction of the temple. It makes them too sad. They have no other language but the holy tongue. This Eldad Ha-Danite does not understand so much as a single utterance in either the language of Cush or the language of Ishmael. Only the holy tongue. So the image of this Eldad Ha-Danite is an image of a biblical Jew. He was sent to exile before the destruction of the first temple. He's a pure Jew. He speaks Hebrew. He doesn't know any other language. He's an archetype of the original Judaism as it should have been, untainted by diaspora, untainted by the exile, enclosed somewhere behind the mountains. Moreover, The holy tongue that he speaks contain words that we never heard. For instance, he calls a dove a tintera, a bird a rikot, and peppers a dalmush. So his Hebrew had these strange things, strange expressions. The people of Karua weren't naive. They believed the story of the 10 lost tribes, but they didn't take Eldad's words for it face value. They put him to the test, and they had the same methods as modern anthropologists do today. They write, we wrote down many examples of the words that he used. After showing him an item, he told us its name in the holy tongue, and we wrote it down. So they show him a cup, and he says, kos, and they write it down. A pen, he says, et, they write it down. Days later, we return and ask Eldad to repeat the name of each and every item. And we found it was the same as before, meaning he didn't lie to us. His language was authentic. Now comes a surprising part. Their Talmud is composed in eloquent, holy tongue. There is no mention of any sage, either from the Mishnah or the Talmud. So first of all, he has a Talmud. He has the oral law, not only the written law. But our Talmud, our Mishnah, has names of sages. And it says Rabbi Akiva received from this and that rabbi, who received from this and that rabbi. We have this change of transmission of oral law from one to another. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Papa, Amar Rabbeinu. They don't have that. Their Talmud is not in Aramaic, it's in Hebrew. And instead of this change of transmission, the following is stated in every passage. Thus we learned from the mouth of Joshua, who learned it from the mouth of Moses, who learned it from the mouth of the Almighty. So they have the oral, they have the Talmud, but their change of transmission is directly to Joshua, received it from Moses, received it from the Almighty. So you see how this plays into the idea that we have the original Jew over here. That he has the oral law as it was given on Mount Sinai. Now, I think I skipped this in the experts I gave you here, but this is the reason that they decided to send a letter to the Gaon in Baghdad. They saw that there's some differences between his Talmud and our Talmud, and this invoked them to send a letter to the Gaon, which we won't deal with here. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? If we think about his Talmud, and you know anything about the time and place where this was written, you know that this is a time where the Karaites started to flourish. The Karaites were Jews who did not believe in the oral law. They said that the rabbis invented the Mishnah and the Talmud, and God only gave us the Bible. Obviously, the ideas that Eldad had about the Talmud played into rabbinic propaganda. You see, they say to the Karaites, also the original Jews, those who weren't tainted by the exile, have exactly the same Talmud as we have. And their Talmud comes directly from Mount Sinai. So we could already sense that there's a political and ideological bias to this text. And indeed, it was used to that reason, which raised the question, how much of this is true? Did Eldad exist? Did he come from the 10 lost tribes? Is the story true at all? So here, and I won't go into it in details, but we could say two things. First of all, we have testimonies close to the same period that testify that a guy called Eldad which suits the description that we have, existed. For example, I brought here from Chisdai ibn Shafut. Chisdai ibn Shafut was a famous vizier to the Andalusian Khalif, Abd al-Rahman III, and he writes in the 10th century, 100 years after Eldad. In the days of our forefathers, a sagest man of Israel turned up in our community. He would display his lineage in the tribe of Dan, as far back as Dan, the son of Jacob. He would fluently speak Hebrew and had a word for everything in the holy tongue. What is more, nothing escaped his eyes. Upon getting ready to preach, he would say, Otniel ben Knaz, received from Joshua, who received from Moses, who received from the Almighty. So this description suits Eldad squarely. And it was written shortly after Eldad visited the same regions of North Africa and later probably Spain. I think it's safe to say that a guy called Eldad existed and that he did proclaim of coming from the tribe of Dan. On the other hand, we could also prove that he did not have biblical knowledge. He did only biblical knowledge. He had also post-biblical knowledge. Many of the stories that Eldad tells, for example, his descriptions of the tribes, his laws, his oral laws that he brought with him, are obviously written after the exile of the 10 lost tribes. I brought here one midrash that parallels Eldad. It's later, but it has earlier versions. It talks about the 10 lost tribes, that they have no impure animals, domesticated or wild, and no impure fowl, and no type of ground crawler. And with them is only sheep and cattle. This is a text that describes how the 10 lost tribes are closed behind the magical river, Sambation, we'll talk about it in a moment, and they live a pure and holy life, and they have no evil or impure creatures, only pure ones. Such stories about the 10 lost tribes existed much earlier than Eldad. We find them in all kinds of midrash, and in parallels also in Christian texts and Jewish texts. So obviously Eldad did not invent his stories. He picked out and elaborated text that existed before him. So we could say, on the one hand, a guy called Eldad probably exists, and he claimed to come from the tribe of Dan. On the other hand, he did not come from the tribe of Dan. Who was he? What was he? Most of the scholars call him a charlatan, a liar. I'm not definitely sure that's the case. I could imagine two scenarios. One is that he actually came from a community that thought that it was a part of the tribe of Dan, a community who had a tradition that they are the sons of Dan. Meaning he didn't think that he lied. He had an authentic tradition, though it wasn't true. We have tribes in India who believe they are part of the tribes of Menashe. We have tribes in Africa who think they're Jewish tribes. Many tribes thought they have a Jewish lineage. It could be that Eldad came from one of these tribes. And the reason I think it's authentic because his traditions are very lively. He has laws of shechita, how to kill a ritual slaughtering of an animal to eat. And you see that this is a living tradition of people who grew animals and know how to deal with it. So this is one tradition, this is one option, that Eldad came and he had an authentic tradition that he comes from the tribe of Dan. Another option is that most of the texts we have attributed to Eldad were attributed to him later. He did not compose it. And the history of the text here is very complicated. It went through a lot of copying and transmission, and the the only full-fledged text attributed to Eldad are actually from the 15th century. So it might be that there was a guy called Eldad. He did proclaim to come from the tribe of Dan, but none of the texts attributed to him are actually his. These are two options. On top of the option that, yes, maybe he was just a liar who invented the whole thing. But if we look about these earlier traditions, for example, the one about the 10 lost tribes being closed behind a magical river. This exists also in Eldad, but Eldad does not attribute that to the tribes. Eldad claims that this magical river called Sambation is in the vicinity of the 10 lost tribes. We'll read it in a moment. This magical river that most of you might have heard about is a river that, according to legends, turns rocks and stones for 6 days a week in a very violent manner, so no man could surpass it. And on the seventh day, on the Sabbath, it rests. And that's why it's called Sambation River, the river of Shabbat. This legend is very ancient. We have it already in the 1st century, mentioning of this river. Josephus Flavius mentioned this river. The Talmudian, the Talmud, the Jerusalem, the Palestinian Talmud says that the 10 lost tribes were exiled beyond that river. So this is an ancient tradition. This beautiful picture, this is a promo for the next talk, which my good friend Rebecca Voss is going to give, and this is from her book, actually, dealing with the Red Jews. This is why they're called the Red Jews. Ask Rebecca next week. In any case, Eldad also has this river, but he attributes it only to the Levites, the sons of Moses, he calls them. And he says, when the temple was destroyed, a cloud came and carried the Levites, the sons of Moses, along with their tents and their sheep and their cattle, to Evilas, to our country, the country of the 10 lost tribes, and dropped them off there during the night. Moreover, Eldad told us that our fathers, who heard from their fathers, told us that that same night they heard a great noise, and in the morning they saw legions of mighty Levites. God had enclosed them by a river that appended rocks and sand in a place where there had never previously been a river. So magically, miraculously, when the temple was destructed 150 years after the exile of the tribe of Dan, the Levites were carried magically to the land of the 10 lost tribes. And they were put amidst the 10 lost tribes, but circulated by this magical river that encompasses them and closed them there. To this day, Eldad says, the river calamitously flings rocks and stones without water. If the river were to hit a mountain of iron, the latter would be shattered. All 6 days of the week, the river appends stones and sands without a drop of water. And on the Sabbath, it rests. Its name is a Sambation. And among them, the Levites, there is not a single wild beast, an impure domesticated animal, abominable creatures, or insects. Everybody has sheep and cattle, and they plow and they sow. So you see, these 3 lines are almost identical to the lines we read on the previous slide. Eldad used these stories and incorporated them into his own story. The idea of this river, the Sambation River, is that it encloses the 10, in this case, not the 10 lost tribes, the sons of Levites, but in later versions, the whole 10 lost tribes. It encloses them so they can't escape, or they can't come to rescue their brothers in the rest of the world. And the reason they can't go is not because of the rocks and stones that it throws so violently, but because they observe the Shabbat and they won't cross the river on the Saturday. So they're justly, they are saintly enclosed so they can't come and help their brothers. This aspect this magical aspect of the existence of the 10 lost tribes, or the Levites in this story, is what became very famous and was elaborated by generations of other readers and rereading of this text. This is the part of the story that also reached the ears of Christians, and you could hear it echoing in other texts along history. Just as an example, we'll take a very famous letter from the Middle Ages called the Letter of Prester John. When the Crusader state in the 12th, 13th century got into trouble, was weakened by Arab invasions, and lost hope, all of a sudden they found this magical redeemer called Prester John. Europe discovered that somewhere beyond Arab land, somewhere, in this case, people imagine it at Ethiopia, but before that, people thought it's in Asia somewhere, there's a magical Christian king in an utopian land called Prester John. He's a priest and a king. He combines both. And Europe received this fictitious letter from this mythical figure called Prester John. And in that letter, he described his land. This is one of the first utopians written in the West, because it describes how his land is rich with gold, and he lives among the Amazons and all kind of mythical creatures. Among these mythical creatures are also the Jews, the 10 lost tribes. I, Presbyter Johannes, this is how the letter starts, Prester John, the Lord of Lords, surpass all under heaven in virtue, in riches, and in power. 72 kings pay us tribute. The Amazons and the Bahmins are subject to us. And it continues entirely. And you see here the pictures of some of the creatures that were supposedly lived in Prester John's land. Among these, he says, true, beyond the river of stones are the 10 tribes. So here you have the Sambation river and the 10 tribes of the Jews. And you could hear the debate between Jews and Christians about who is in control of whom. So the 10 tribes of the Jews, who although they contrive kings, meaning the Jews will tell you in your lands, in Europe, the Jews will tell you that their lost tribe have kings, but this is a lie. Although they contrive kings for themselves, they're in fact our servants and are tributaries to our excellency. The 10 lost tribes are subjected to Prester John, and they pay tax to Prester John. So this is an echo of a theological debate between Christian and Jews, whether the Jews have political power or not. The Christian told the Jews in medieval Europe, you have no political power because God has abandoned you. And the Jews said, oh no, we have the 10 lost tribes. We have a king somewhere. So this is a Christian response to that, saying, no, your magical creatures, your magical brothers are subjected to our magical creatures, to our myth. So one myth is subjected to the other. But you could hear the theological debate from Europe echoing here. I want to go back to Eldad's text and see what was his main idea, what was his message to the Jews of his time. And it's interesting because it's not what we would have imagined. And because we are used to imagine the 10 lost tribes as this magical power behind the Sambation river in a magical land, this is not how Eldad portrays them. The main part, the lion's share of his letter, is a description of the tribe's daily conduct of war. They, the 10 tribes, and I'm reading from Eldad letter again, are immersed in battle with the 7 kings of Cush. It takes 7 months to traverse their land, and 5 of those same kings, with whom they are constantly at war, surround them from the backside and 2 flanks. Whoever among the tribes is faint-hearted is placed at the service of God. Every man of strength is put to war, and they do not budge from their post. Upon their induction, they do not mobilize in mixed units. Every tribe has his own time. The warrior of Dan have 3 months of fixed duties. They chase their foes on their horses and do not dismount all week long. On the eve of the Sabbath, they dismount wherever they happen to be, and their horses stand with their arms of warfare. If their foes do not confront them, they rest on Sabbath in accordance with the law. And if their enemies do attack, they set forth with all their arms and slay many of them as the courage of the Holy One imbues them. Within the ranks are brave men from amongst the sons of Samson and Delilah, who run to engage their foes in battle. The smallest among them will chase many, and each of them shouts the battle cry loud as the roar of the lion. To God shall be victory. May your courage be imparted to your nation, the tribe of Yeshurun Selah. And they battle and war until the 3 months are over, whereupon they come with all the booty to King Adil, and he divides everything up evenly among the Israelites. They're constantly in war. They fight, but they're heroes. If you notice the episode about the Sabbath, disbarking their horses, but nevertheless fighting if needed. So you already see that this is post-biblical, because it was Rabbi Akiva, who we met at the beginning of this evening, who said, the laws of the Torah are to live in, and you're allowed not to preserve the Shabbat to maintain your life. So here, these 10 tribes do the same as Rabbi Akiva taught us. You're allowed to defile the Shabbat in order to save your life. And they fight, and they battle in war until the 3 months are over, whereupon they come with all the booty, and we read this. And when Dan finishes fighting, the same can be said for the 3-month rotation of Gad, Asher, and Naphtali until the 12 months are complete. And then the annual cycle is repeated, meaning every tribe of the 4 months maintains the borders for a 3 month, and they rotate between themselves. Now, they have these heroes, the sons of Samson and Delilah. When I read this text, I imagine these brave warriors. And one question nagged me: why don't they win? Why are they constantly in war? If they're so brave, why do they fight all the time? Why don't they achieve victory and sit in peace, study the Torah, whatever? And then I understood that actually this is what Eldad's message was. This is exactly what he needed the tribes to do. And here I come to the conclusion of this talk. Eldad did not enclose the 10 lost tribes behind the river Sambation. He actually freed them from behind that mythical river. He kept only the Levites, only a small portion who live in a magical land. He actually freed the 10 lost tribes and brought them to the doorstep of the Jewish diaspora. They're just here at Avila, they're at Chavila, they're around the corner here in Africa, maybe in Kush, just around the corner. And the image of the lost tribe that he offered is not of a magical existence. It's not an utopian land. No, they are constantly in war. But this is a normal free life, a political independent existence of a military power. This is the image that he offered the Jews in the diaspora. Why? Because this is the image they needed. The messianic aspiration they had was for normality, for a free, independent state with a military power. Standing at the eve of the Middle Ages, already desperate from going back to the Holy Land, the thing that Jews needed more than most, the wildest imagination that their messianic apocalyptic view could offer them, was a normal existence. And this is exactly what Eldad offered them in the image of the 10 lost tribes he gave them. Only later generations imbued it with magical utopian elements. Thank you.
Just a minute, I'm trying to get my video started.
Sure. I could continue talking though. I'll just say that later versions of Eldad Ha-Dani are incredibly magical. You'll find that the 10 lost tribes live where rivers of gold and diamonds flow, and magical creatures, leopards and giraffes and etc. live. All of the Greek mythology found its way into the land of the 10 lost tribes. But these are only later retelling of the story.
So the earlier version that Eldad himself was promoting was a really very realistic.
If it was Eldad, yes.
That was Eldad, yes.
The earlier versions.
All right, so we do have questions coming in. I'm going to do my best to relay them to you. Actually, we have now 3 different people asking the same question, which is, what was the Gaon's response to the letter from Kairouan? And I think let's hear about, if you know what the Gaon responded, and maybe also more generally, what were the responses of other sort of authoritative figures in the Jewish world? Like, what was Eldad well received?
So I glossed a lot of the story here in the 40 minutes I was given. The main concern they had, in order to answer what the Gaon's answer was, we have to understand the question first. The main question, the main concern was about halachic matters that differed in Eldad's version than the version that they had of the Talmud. So first, the Gaon says, yes, Eldad says the truth. And not only that, 2 people told me that they met him. Apparently, Eldad went through southern Iraq of today, and he met some Jews who went up to Baghdad and told the Gaon that this guy is spreading these stories. So he says, yes, he tells the truth. And how do I know he tells the truth? Because his stories of the 10 lost tribes are in sync with the stories that we know about them. Now, obviously, the reason is because Eldad was citing Midrash. So, of course, the stories were in sync. It's the same text. But for the Gaon, this is proof that Eldad was telling the truth, because he had the same traditions about the 10 lost tribes as we know about. Beyond that, he says, Eldad, concerning the differences in tradition, Eldad must have been tired from the long journey. There's only one Torah, and we, the Gaons, the yeshiva in Babylonia, we hold it. Every difference between our version and his version, ours is authoritative, not his. So the stories about 10 tribes, yes. His traditions, no.
All right, I'm looking at all the questions. So it sounds like the jury was out a little bit. In other words, they're willing to entertain the possibility that he was, coming from a real place, but not accepting the changes that he suggested in tradition. That brings to mind another question that people had asked, which was to ask you to expand a little bit more on the connection that you made to Karaism, or possibly also to Samaritans, right? Do you have the sense that Eldad was connected to real existing Jewish communities or traditions who were isolated and perhaps had a separate stream of tradition relating back to the biblical era?
So yes. First of all, scholars identified him with Samaritans, with Karaites, anti-Karaites, Rabbinites, the lore of the land of Israel, the lore of Babylonian. people identified with everything. And first of all, the tradition of his text is a bit problematic. What I found there is that his traditions are unique, and they don't abide any of the known traditions we know, which mean he could have been Karaite or anti-Karaite or rabbinic or anti-rabbinic. The reason it is so is because he represents an early stage in the unification of Jewish knowledge, meaning somewhere at the beginning of the Middle Ages, we had many traditions. Every community, in a way, had its own tradition, its own stories, its own laws of Shechita, for example. What happened during the Middle Ages, and this is my main concern with transmission of knowledge, is that these traditions were lost. They were all unified under one umbrella, and that of the Babylonian tradition. Eldad is this rare remnant of that tradition because it was attached to the stories of the 10 lost tribes. Because he has this formula, my traditions are from Joshua, from the name of Moses, from the Almighty. That's why they stood the changing of time and reached us. And we could learn about many other traditions that existed and disappeared. So he's not a Karaite, he's not a Samaritan, he's not a Rabbinite, but he represents one of these actually Orthodox or one of these Jewish traditions that existed and disappeared.
Thank you. That's fascinating to really think about the big picture of the Middle Ages being a moment when Jewish traditions were getting consolidated. We have a question that I'll actually just read directly out. Fred asks, as you explain it, this is a myth of what we would describe as political self-determination, right? You for sure suggested that. However, it is diasporic. So can you say more about how it's messianic or how it relates to a messianic image of a returned Jewish king?
Right. So the 10 lost tribes were messianic images before Eldad and after Eldad. Right? He outstands within this tradition. Already in the 5th century, the 10 lost tribes are attached to the Antichrist or to the second coming of Christ. And they were attached to apocalyptic and messianic scenarios, always, as fighting at the side of the Messiah or against the Messiah. And Eldad, in this case, he offers a messianism which is anti-messianic, absolutely. He offers the 10 lost tribes as a normative, regular, independent existence. So I think that at this moment in history, this was as much messianic as you know, the imagination of a magical ending where the temple falls from the sky. This was so far-fetched for the Jews, and this was what they needed to know that a normal existence could exist. And you could compare it to Maimonides. Maimonides is the image of the end of times, of the Messiah in Maimonides. Is it messianic? The image he gives is that nothing will change. The only thing that will change under the Messiah is that the Jews won't be subjected to non-Jews. That's all. It's messianic because this is how it describes the messianic age. So Eldad gave the same, he played on a messianic theme. He downplayed on it in a way, because this is what they needed at the time. This is as much as Jews could imagine. And this nurtured their messianic expectation for the 1,000 years. We're still looking for the 10 lost tribes. He reintroduced them into circulation in a very natural way, and he presented them really just at the border of the known land. They could come every moment here.
Do the stories about Eldad, this is another question that somebody submitted, intersect with or relate to the stories of the Khazars? Is this the same era? And are the same kinds of people also imagining that there's the kingdom of the Khazars that converted to Judaism? If you can talk about that at all.
So there's no, as far as I know, there's no literary overlapping. These are two strains of different stories, but both stories fulfill the same function. Yes, both stories imagined an independent Jewish state, you might say. This of converts and this of 10 lost tribes. The letter that we read by Chiztai ibn Shafrut talking about Eldad was a letter that he sent to the king of the Khazars. And so he makes this connection already. The king of the Khazars, as far as we know, maybe didn't even exist. For those of you who don't know, this is also sort of, people debate whether it's real or not. At the moment, I think the pendulum is at the far left, that most historians think it's a myth that never existed, the Khazar state or the Khazar conversion. But this was a myth in the Middle Ages where Jews and non-Jews believed that there was a independent Jewish state, the Khazars, somewhere in between Byzantium and Kiev Rus, that converted to Judaism. So these two stories fulfill the same function. I don't know of any crossing between them.
So there's a couple of questions I think that follow up on that are asking about whether you can fill in a little bit more what's going on in Jewish culture in the places that were so receptive to this myth. Why were they interested at this moment in history in thinking about, particularly about an independent Jewish state or sort of Jewish political normality, as you put it?
So first of all, most of the, we can't say about the interest in these texts. The only way we could glance about the popularity or influence text is by, in medieval times, is by how much time this text was copied or cited. So we have these evidence only from much later. Only from the 12th century onward, we have copies of Eldad or citations of his words. And we try to reconstruct the older version of the 9th century. I think what happened was that, imagine the Jewish people were all of a sudden found themselves under Islam. And they see the power of Islam, the unity. And I think this is the moment where the diaspora sprung. We're used to think about 2,000 years of exile from the destruction of the Second Temple. Titus expelled the Jews. This is not what happened. We know today that this Jews stayed in the Holy Land. You could go and visit the synagogues in the Upper Galilee from the 5th, 6th century. You could see the Mishnah where it was written, the Talmud. Jews stayed in the Holy Land. Jewish diaspora actually starts after the Muslim conquest. All of a sudden, Jews have this opportunity to voyage to North Africa, to Spain, to the Caucasus, all regions. So this is the moment after the Arab conquest is the moment of the birth of the diaspora. And once the Jews understand that this is for good, this is what expects us from now on, they need this myth of a freed state. This is what they need to imagine, that one day we could return to the Holy Land and have an independent state. This is what happens under Islam. Later on in Christian Europe, the story has a different twist, which is a theological one. Christians believe that the fact that Jews have no power, that the scepter has left Judah, means that Shiloh, the Messiah, has arrived. So if the Jews have no kings, and this is openly debated between Jews and Christians, this means Christianity has won. So in Christianity, under Christianity, Jews need an independent kingdom as a theological answer to Christianity.
So switching gears a tiny bit, one person is asking, I think, an interesting question, which is what did, so turning away from how he's received and how the stories build and build over centuries through different cultures, right? Thinking back to Eldad himself, or at least what we can maybe reconstruct of what he might have been like. What does he seem to want? What is he doing there? What is his story about? What he's asking of the places that he visits? Is he just a visitor? And also one person just asked for a clarification. It was Eldad himself who claimed that he was from the tribe of Dan, not that other people assigned him to that tribe. Is that right?
Right. Yes. So let's start from that. If Eldad existed, and he probably existed, he coined this phrase Eldad Ha-Dani, Eldad Ha-Danite, probably. He claimed coming from the tribe of Dan. This is the minimum we could know. Apparently, he's not the only one coming from the tribe of Dan. And this is very interesting. We have several testimonies about Danite people traveling in the region, in North Africa, somewhere at that time. We have several sources. A scholar just published in Jewish history, in a journal called Jewish History, an article about Danites in the Middle Ages, claiming that all these Danite people actually came from the tribe of Dan. I don't buy it, but this somebody thinks that we historians are not brave enough to admit it, to accept it. But I don't know. Scholars claim that Eldad was a storyteller, went from place to place and got his next meal by telling stories. This is what he wanted. And to become famous, to entertain people. It's hard to attain what he wanted and what he did. Recognition, probably. Recognition for his stories, for his traditions. Putting this is a moment where this codification of Jewish tradition starts, and he wants to put forward his own tradition. He brings laws, traditions of halachic laws, of how to slaughter animals. And I imagine he wanted to be taken seriously. Beyond that, I have no clue. You have to understand how rare this source is. We have rarely any sources from the 9th century. Any sources. We don't, Semach Gaon, this Gaon, it could be 2 other people. We don't even know who was the Gaon exactly at the same time. And this is why I said that thanks to this crazy story about the 10 lost tribes, this text was preserved and reached us, even though it was rewritten and changed but it reached us in a way. So it's one text of maybe dozens, thousands that didn't reach us.
Right. So just we're wrapping up. I think I probably don't have time to ask another whole question, but just sort of stepping back when we think about Eldad in the broader time frame of this span of, Jewish messianism across history, we're not looking at Eldad as a Messiah figure. We're looking at Eldad as a kind of bearer or an object of later lore, right? Or a kind of catalyst of a certain kind of lore projecting Jewish messianic restoration. Is that how you would put it, or would you say that differently?
So the 10 lost tribes, you'll see it with, I would say that tribes are a part of any messianic scenario that we have, more or less. You'll see with Rebecca next week, they're extremely important for medieval Jews. Eldad is the guy that reintroduces them into circulation. So he single-handedly is in charge of one of the most important messianic scenarios that we had. He was not a messianic figure himself. He didn't even think that maybe the story is about them. It might be that they're not messianic at all. For him, it's just this ordinary day of life. But he absolutely contributed to messianism more than many others did. He reintroduced these 10 lost tribes. He gave Jews hope. What is messianism? Messianism is a basic hope that Jewish existence in the diaspora could change. And he gives them hope that can. Here's your army. Here are the people who are going to bring you forth the Messiah. They're trained warriors. They have a king. They judge the 4 penalties. So he's definitely a messianic figure, malgré lui-même, against his own will.
Despite himself. Yeah.
Despite himself.
That's a fantastic way to end. And it's such a wonderful contrast also with last week, really like the messianic figures that we heard about from 1,000 years earlier were all very much a part of that world. They were still in the world of expectation, and they were among the lineages and the political figures. And now we've jumped to where, in order to think about that, there has to be something brought back from obscurity. So that's where we are now. We had a moment in Jewish history when Jews are going to start thinking about the return of that kind of political independence. So I want to invite everybody to join us again. Just to clarify, Rebecca Foss is speaking about some late medieval, early modern messianic figures this Thursday. So just 2 days from now. We don't even have to wait a week to go another couple hundred years.
People are busy. I wanted to thank you and just say, I see there's a lot of questions and I haven't read them yet. I put down my email in the chat. If anybody has a question, you could feel free to email me. I'll try to answer as best I can.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. I see it now. That's amazing. So thank you, Micha, for being with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if you are in the United States, please make sure that you and everyone you know is voting today. We will see you all hopefully again here in 2 days. Thank you again, Micha. Take care.
Thank you very much.